Good afternoon, and welcome to our third conversation with the Christian Muslim Studies Network here at the University of Edinburgh. I'm delighted today to be able to welcome Sinan Antoon to join us in a conversation. Professor Antoon is an associate professor at NYU in New York, but he's also very well known as a poet, as a novelist, and as a social critic. He's the author of 4 different novels, all originally written in Arabic, but all have also been translated. They cover a wide swath of themes, especially related to modern Iraq, as well as ideas of memory, exile, home, as well as religion. I only have 3 of them in my office at home because one is stuck back at my office, which is inaccessible. The Corpse Washer, which is translated from Yale University Press, is his second novel, and looks at questions related to the U.S. invasion, themes of memory, death, through the lens of a Shiite community in Baghdad, especially in the practice of ritual washing. His third book, Ya Maryam, which was translated into English as the Baghdad Eucharist in 2017 with Hupe Fiction, and then most recently, which is translated by Jonathan Wright, which is the Book of Collateral Damage. And his first book, Ijam, which I don't have with me, is a fascinating work, especially if you read it in Arabic. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with Sinan and talk about the varieties of his work. We'll have a conversation initially about some of the themes. For those of you watching either on Facebook Live or on YouTube Live, you should be able to comment in the side. And if you comment, we can bring up the question and have Professor Antoon answer that. So in about 20 minutes or so, I'll give you that opportunity. So welcome, Sinan. Thank you for joining me all the way from New York.
Thank you, Joshua. It's a pleasure and an honor. I'm so happy to be having this conversation and to be having it with you in particular. So I'm really looking forward.
Yeah, maybe I'll start briefly with an autobiographical moment, since those sort of run through your novel in many ways. I actually had picked up the first novel I read of yours was the Baghdad Eucharist, which I know we had a conversation online about it being translated as that rather than Ave Maria or Ya Maryam. I was in Cairo at AUC's bookstore in the Tahrir area in 2017, and was flipping through the bookstore and picked up a book called the Baghdad Eucharist. As a scholar of religion, theology, and Christian-Muslim relations, it was actually the title that drew me to it. And I started reading it the day before Palm Sunday in 2017 and read it during that Holy Week. And if you remember, that was the year that there was a bombing both in Tanta and in Alexandria on Palm Sunday. And so the themes of Christian belonging, the various ways that Coptic Christians construed their identity in relationship to the state, in relationship to the Pope, Tawadros, as well as these other themes, which are resonant with the ideas in your book, sort of left a lasting impression on me and became sort of a Holy Week reading in a different way. I went out and then grabbed all of your other novels that were available, especially The Corpse Washer, which is actually my personal favorite. So we'll get to that later. But I just wanted to start by juxtaposing those 2 novels, The Corpse Washer and the Baghdad Eucharist, both which offer sort of reflections on the reality of life in Baghdad. In the one case through a Shiite perspective, I don't want to just make it about religion or sectarianism, and the other through Chaldean Christian perspectives. Now, obviously you trouble those ideas in a whole host of ways, but you also start both novels with epitaphs from the Quran and from the Bible respectively. How do you balance the desire to account for the fullness of life in Baghdad on the one hand, take seriously the realities of religious identities, but also push against some of the sectarianism that so often is used as a lens to interpret modern Iraq? I know that's a big question, but
No, that's an excellent question, but I think that is the main challenge, has always been the challenge, and I think it becomes more accentuated in previous decades because of all what has happened and the way these new identities have emerged, and with them new imagined history and new communal and individual identities and all of that. And I'm in an odd position because I don't happen to be a member of the faith community. I'm not a believer,
Yeah.
but I also understand, I appreciate religious traditions aesthetically. And I also understand that these are important structures, emotional and other types of structures in the daily lives of millions of people that live with us in this world. And we have to understand them. With the corpse washer, it was a matter of coincidence in that when I read a story about a corpse washer, he happened to be from a Shiite family, and then I started my research, and that happened. But I should say that for Hiya Maryam, and we can talk about the translation or the publisher imposed translation of the title, that we oftentimes, those of us who translate into English or whose books are translated into English, have to deal with. But you mentioned my first novel, Ajam, and when it came out in 2002, already, unfortunately, some of the critics writing in Arabic were praising the novel, but saying the Christian Iraqi writer is writing about a Christian family. And while the character in the novel is Christian, but the dynamics and the oppression that he suffered could have been suffered by anyone else. So I was very troubled by this sectarian categorization by literary critics, because while of course I come from a Christian background and one cannot change that, but I don't like, as you kind of said, to always have that be the primary defining characteristics of a person. So in a way, I resisted writing about a Christian background because I just wanted to explore, and I find it more challenging to write about something that is outside of my community. I had started writing a novel about a house and a home, and how one's relationship to their home, and then the bombing of the Sayyidat al-Najat church in Baghdad took place, the hostage taking and the massacre. And that was one of the many painful moments in Iraq's recent history, but it's very painful for many reasons. It was the first time, I think, in a very, very, very long time where congregants are attacked while they were praying, and so on and so forth. So that caused me to change the course of the novel, because also at that time, what I had heard and read from Iraqi Christians inside and in the diaspora, some of whom from my extended family, troubled me so much, in that they were, of course, as happens in these cases, reinventing the history of Christianity in Iraq from the current moment going backward. And so that troubled me, and that's in a way how the character of Maha entered, and the novel became, it's still about a home, but home and the many levels of home, the house, home as Iraq, and the different perspectives that are still out there. And it also applies in a way to Egypt and Syria. I get a lot of letters from Egyptians and Syrians who, in a way, identify with this novel because it stages these visceral problems that we're having now.
Yeah, and I think, the home is so central in the novel, whether it's the images on the wall, the pictures of the family, but also I think what you do so well with the perspective of both Yusuf and then Maha is you're able in a non-pedantic way to show the variety of experiences of what it means to be a Christian in Iraq, even if that's not the center, right? Your Yusuf is able to tell a story of what it meant to grow up in another period. And I know some of my colleagues have used this novel in their own courses in religious studies, in part because you're able to get at the complexity of lived reality in a way that often, religious studies or theology books aren't able to encounter. They they're able to account for the vast reality and diversity of what it means to be a human being in Iraq or in Syria or Egypt through this narrative lens. And you don't deny either person's perspective. And in fact, the decision to sort of divide the novel, not quite in half, but close to in half between Maha's perspective and Yusuf's, gives you that lens into this history of Iraq.
No, I'm happy to hear that. And, ironically, the novel also outs the sectarians out there, because I read what readers say in various fora, but especially on Goodreads and elsewhere. And of course, there are those who completely identify with Maha, and there are some minority who attack me because I should have only focused on Maha or only focused on Yusuf. But I think this applies elsewhere. This is the microcosm of the societies that we live in. And what I wanted to show also is that there are two people who are living in the same house and experiencing the exact same events, but of course they have a totally different perspective because of their age, because of their gender, because of their lived experience. So I'm happy to hear that from you. And I wanted just to go back to one thing, is I start the books with references from the Quran and from the Bible, because sometimes people forget these are the primary literary texts that we have. And if one wants to, so they are unavoidable, and I've some parts of them I find very poetic and very meaningful. So it only makes sense in a way to me, because they kind of also illuminate the entire text. And
there's a way in which to go to the corpse washer, the ways in which the Quran is suffused throughout that text, in part because of the ritual practices of cleansing before burying, in the ways that is ever present. But the ways in which Jawad, I find that incredible, moving, the sense of continuing the ritual practice that is handed down to him in a way. I think there's a passage I put up a few days ago in the first few pages where his father, or he interprets his father's faith as much stronger than his. He's carrying out the rituals without faith, right, to guard his heart. And yet the visceral ways in which death, memory, physical actions are sort of interwoven in his practices, but the ways that your text is able to also inhabit his I don't want to say his lack of faith, but the pain or absence of faith that is present is incredibly moving, and resists this sort of simplistic account of what religion entails, right? It's not just about belief. There's a whole host of ritual practices that are handed down that he feels the need to continue, even despite of his own desire to flee in many ways.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to hear that. And through the course of the novel, he comes to understand the importance of these rituals and how they structure and punctuate daily life and death, and how they articulate these boundary moments that even if he did not believe in them, that now he understood in a way their importance in the daily lives of people. And I think this is, there are many Jawads out there in a way, and I think one of the reasons why this novel appeals to, at least I've been told by readers in Iraq and elsewhere, is that it also speaks to that type of person who lives in this society or lives in a context where there is a visible, strong adherence to religious rituals and religious creed, and he or she might not share that totally. But that doesn't mean that they completely reject it, because they understand where it's coming from. But there is a certain sense of alienation. But it's not one of total rejection. It's one total realization of having to, although it's an overused word, but to coexist with what they've been given and the context that they were born into. And personally, I happen to find religious rituals from various traditions to be very moving. And I see them, and I hope it comes out in the novel, as works of art. And they're also, oftentimes, they are texts that encapsulate some very meaningful and nuanced and very deep ideas about our being as a species in this world. That's why a lot of these rituals have survived, because they are able to, in a way, encapsulate and crystallize very complicated feelings about, as you said, life and death, being, mortality, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and in both, we'll get to the other novels as well, but in both The Corpse Washer and in Ya Maryam, you have the ways in which these rituals, especially the intersection of one's own death and the presence or absence of God, sort of culminate in many ways in both novels in very different ways. But there's also a sense, especially in The Corpse Washer, where the rituals come to haunt the imagination and come to haunt Jawad, but also others, that he almost can't escape this. And you can see this in some of your other works as well. Dreams have a big part to play, or even maybe nightmares in your work. Can you talk about this, the recurring use of sort of dreams in The Corpse Washer, in the Book of Collateral Damage, and how that works to account for sort of the deep memory, trauma, ecstasy, love that are present in your characters?
No, that's an excellent question. Even in the first novel, Jam, there's a lot of nightmares, and I mean, there are many levels to this, I think. I mean, first of all, very simple. I always thought, we spend 1/3 of our lives, more or less, sleeping and dreaming and having nightmares. So it would only make sense that I allow for this 1/3 of our lives to enter into my narratives. But it's also that I guess it so happens that with the character in Ajam or The Corpse Washer, they are all, in a way, individuals that are trapped in a certain context or situation caused by external forces, and they cannot flee. So Farad is in prison and he's being tortured. So of course he's going to have a lot of nightmares because his psyche is already wounded. And the same goes for Jawad, because it's not the rituals themselves, it's the excessive death that he has to deal with and see every day that of course haunts him. And I mean, on a purely artistic level, I think, I mean, in writing dreams and nightmares, I think I feel that I have more leeway in that it can be, especially that I like non-linear narratives and texts. In a dream, it can be non-linear, it can be very symbolic, and the imagery one has more leeway in terms of the imagery. And I think if done successfully, it also, distills so much of the psychological state of the character, but also, I mean, it's a cliche, but the unconscious is always there. And of course, with the dreams and the nightmares, the rational reason takes a break, and desires and fears are all out there in this oftentimes haunting but very beautiful configuration. And the novel that I'm writing now also has nightmares. Maybe I should cut down on the nightmares.
I don't know. If one wants to account for our world, I don't think you can count down on the nightmares.
Especially, I mean, who is it? Joyce said, I think it's the history is this nightmare that I'm trying to wake up from, or something like that.
So, I mean, the dreams are also part of another tendency you have in your work to have these sort of short, almost short stories or short snippets or vignettes within the novel, often that sort of carry a lot of weight. So I've mentioned, for instance, the sort of family portraits in the Baghdad Eucharist that sort of tell a history of a family in Iraq through a photo, or the ways, especially in the Book of Collateral Damage, you have these sort of colloquial collections. I remember the one of the first ones early is this story of the stamp collecting, in which you're able to somehow collapse, at least for me, in a very short span of time, this long history of family, of hope, of possibility, of tradition, that's then crushed by the war, by invasions, by bombs. You have a number of these stories where where a long tradition that's passed down is suddenly destroyed, but in some ways the collection of the book collector of both, is it Wadud? Is that the name in Iraq?
Yeah.
As well as the author himself are able to, by collecting these, are able to sort of salvage them in some ways from their destruction, while also bearing witness to their destruction. So tell me about, I mean, is this in part because of Arab literary traditions, your own practices as a poet, or why do you focus on having so many of these little vignettes in your writing? I mean, same with Ijam. I mean, it is in some way a collection of these.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are several reasons, and I could be wrong, of course. I mean, I came out in my generation with the first novel. You know, I wanted to write something different structurally and, frankly, intentionally, to also make use of this rich prose tradition that we have in the Arabic tradition. Because so many writers are very enamored with the latest fads that come from the so-called West, which is fine. I'm not an isolationist, but having read and studied and have been a lover of Arabic literature from a young age, I realized that we have a very rich narrative tradition that we could use. But also considering everything that has happened in Iraq in terms of dictatorship and the wars. I mean, I have been personally, although not directly, of course, I didn't have to fight in a war. I wasn't wounded. I didn't die. But, you know, so much was shattered because of war, because of militarization, because of consecutive wars and destructions. And to my mind, a linear narrative. Also, I did not like linear, simplistic narratives. I was always looking for something that has fragmentation, that has these types of aspects. And that, to me, looks like the most appropriate vehicle to convey what I want to convey. And it also gives me the opportunity to put in a lot of different snippets and different texts that seem to be from different genres all together in one place. And frankly, ultimately, it fits the atmosphere of the novel, because if Forat is a prisoner who is psychologically damaged and he's writing, hallucinating, trying to reconstruct his memory on bits and pieces of paper that are then found in the archive, and as any file, they are not going to be in order in a way to start with. And the same thing with the Book of Collateral Damage. It's about damage and destruction, and about the futile but necessary attempt to reconstruct the past and reconstruct being, and putting all those fragments together. And the same thing with I guess, the so-called corpse washer. I mean, there is a long tradition you know of, and some of the audience might know of. That's what, I guess, to answer your question, I've always been fascinated by the prose books, the books of adab from the so-called golden age, because you read them and you see that a book can actually contain poems, it contains small anecdotes, it can contain knowledge, it contain biographical tidbits. And of course, until very recently, the Orientalists said, well, this is just the problematic Oriental mind that cannot, but then they discover that actually they have a very elaborate structure. So that's what I try to do in my novels, is to have something. I don't want to use terms such as authentic and whatnot, but just something that comes out of this tradition, which is the tradition that I was born into and that I was raised in as a writer, in a way.
Yeah, so in a way, it both honors the tradition that you're emerging from and writing out of, but it also accounts for the fragmentation of modern Iraq, of the Iran-Iraq War in the first book, in the U.S.-led invasion, in the reality of the ongoing occupation. So you're able to account for all of these fragmentations, but also in some sense, honor the varieties of Arab literary production, whether that's in prose, whether that's in sort of novels, aphorisms that you can see coming out, in the use of ritual theological language that holds many meanings. So that's really helpful to talk about that. I mean, obviously, your novels are mostly about modern Iraq or about someone in exile from modern Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how much does I mean, I don't even know how to get into this, but let's start with the ways in which maybe it's depicted in sort of themes and beauty. So thinking about the place of the rivers, thinking about the urban setting, and then I think also the importance of trees. In Ya Maryam, you have the theme of the date palm, and then of course in the Corpse Watcher, which was what Shajarat al-Rumman, or
yes. Yeah, palm. واحدة شجرة الرمان.
You have the pomegranate tree. So the ways in which, and obviously you as an Iraqi who is in the States and has been back a few times. I mean, how the sense in which you try to depict in some ways an Iraq, I don't want to say before, but there is a sense of an Iraq before that comes out in some of the memories, but it's never apart from the Iraq after the Iran War, after the U.S. invasion, after the first U.S. I mean, how the ways in which that, as you were saying, home, land, Iraq, Baghdad especially, are depicted and function almost as characters in the novel.
No, that's an excellent question. And again, it's a very important issue, whether in terms of literary production and art, but also politically, because the way we deal with the past. And whether in my articles or in my own being, I am not one to ever belittle the horrors of dictatorship and of Saddam Hussein regime. But the problem is that the discourse that was sold to the world by the United States right before 2003 was internalized by so many around the world and so many inside Iraq, so that this before and after is looked as if it's some kind of rigid binary or some kind of break. Well, it's not a break. I'm always reminded, and I always cite a famous poem by a great Iraqi poet, Saad Yusuf, أيها الحنين يا عدوي, nostalgia my enemy, because he warns against nostalgia on several levels for the artist in exile and the diaspora and so on and so forth. So I read a critic whose name I forgot because I'm getting old, but about the two types of nostalgia, or the reflective nostalgia and restorative nostalgia. And I guess my types of writing, I think, fall into reflective nostalgia, meaning it's not restorative. We will never go back. And that past also was not so rosy in a way. It's very problematic. So that's why in my thinking and in my writing and in my novels, there are always these interruptions, because it's about your point of reference, right? If you reference now, and also how does this politically function? And human beings tend to have a very selective memory. This applies to the United States as well. When someone says, make America great again, or we have the famous poem by Langston Hughes about Maha and Yusuf, remembering that in the past, the modalities of being an Iraqi from a certain religious background were not the same as they are now. That doesn't mean at all that there was no tension. Also, there is tension everywhere in the world between people who come from different groups. There are different levels. It's also how politicized this tension becomes. So it's always important for me that our remembering of the past does not become some sort of uncritical nostalgia for what used to exist, but to show the transformations negative changes that have happened and the loss of certain ways of being an Iraqi or being a Christian. Ultimately, it's all about actually how expansive is Iraqi identity as a potential. And I think, it's always important to go back, not just to the 70s and 60s, but I hope to go back in my future work to the 30s and 40s and 50s to go to, and just remembering those times and just thinking about them is very important, I think. In addition to, of course, the primary reason, which these are very important narratives and histories. So when it comes to Ya Maryam, so many, folks wrote to me who are from Yusuf's generation, who were happy that they could inhabit that character because they saw themselves, and so many from a younger generation who, knew these types of Yusufs and were happy to see them in a work of literature.
Yeah, and in doing that, you're able to resist some of the either ors. I mean, whether it's your own politics in terms of the ways in which I was in the States recently out of university when the invasion, the second invasion happened, and there was this sense it was either you're for Saddam or you're if you're against the invasion, you're for Saddam, or vice versa. In the same ways that often the sort of the depiction often of the politics of Christians from Iraq, I know Egypt context a little better, it's either you have to support the strongman, whether it's Sisi or previously Mubarak. Sorry, when I said Sisi, I thought I said Siri. And some of these the ways in which the complexities and multiplicities of identity,
yes.
But also the ways in which how can we envision an alternative to the either hegemony of the sort of theocratic sectarianism or the sort of nationalism that dominated during, the earliest parts of at least the Ba'athist regime. And I think, novels are able to get at this in a way that, as someone who works on sort of religion and politics, we struggle to encapsulate beyond these sort of binaries.
No, I agree completely. And I just wanted to say that, because human beings are not robots and they're very complicated. And, when we read in the theory that identity is fluid, it is fluid.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I'm happy you said that. And that's very important to move beyond the simplistic cookie cutter division or rigid either or, which is the discourse. And until it has changed, but until now, any critique, or oftentimes when you critique the current regime in Iraq, then you're labeled as somehow, pro-Ba'athist or pro-Saddam and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So I see we've got a number of questions.
Really?
If other people want to, I'll show them up there. Okay. If anyone wants to write in a question, either in English or in Arabic, I can bring it up. So there's a couple. I won't necessarily get through all of them. I know. One of ours who's always coming. He's writing from. Are you in Iran, Reza? An Irani philosopher of religion at the University of Tehran is asking. I know what your academic background is in theology, philosophy, or sociology. I know the answers to this, but how you interweave some of your academic work. Maybe you can talk about your own academic work in relationship to this.
Yeah, no, I studied English literature in Baghdad, and then in the US I studied Arabic literature, specifically classical Arabic literature. And part of that, of course, is studying the Quran and all of that. But no, I had to do, my background is not in theology, but I've always been fascinated by faith and religious traditions. Even though, as I said, I'm not a person of faith, but for the novels, for the Wahda Shajat al-Rumman, I had to do some serious research because to be able to inhabit the character of Jawad and know about all of these rituals, one has to really, I think, do a lot of research. Because also one fear that those of us who left their country decades ago would have, is how to write about a place that you haven't, lived in such a long time. But when it comes to Ya Maryam, I mean, I grew up in a Christian family, so I was very familiar with those traditions. I used to go to church, and so I know all of these traditions very well because I was raised as a Christian, and it was bittersweet to go back to them because, as I said earlier, and actually, but in writing the novel, I read just again, and I discovered that especially a lot of these traditions that we have, and the liturgy has very ancient Mesopotamian roots. And what fascinates me the most, actually, is, of course, to speak of breaks and non-breaks, is how much of the monotheistic religious traditions and their narratives and their rituals, of course, have their roots in pre-monotheistic traditions, pagan traditions in the region itself. So no, I did not study theology or that. But of course, I should say that I've made use of my study of classical Arabic literature, of course, and incorporating some of those techniques in my novel, especially the last one, Fihris.
And Reza, if you can find, well, you could read it in the Arabic, Reza. I know you're listening, but you can be the judge of how well he's depicted the reality of Shia ritual practices as a scholar of Shiism. But at least, again, I'm not a Shia as well, and my academic work has been much more on Sunni Islam. But it seems a quite powerful and accurate depiction of the ways in which Shiism and the ritual practices of body washing, as well as the relationship to places like Najaf, Karbala, obviously the memory of Hussein is present. So I'll ask you, Reza, in a few weeks if you send me an email of what you think after you read the novel.
And I just want to say something just briefly that people don't realize, because after the US invasion, we had the notion of mixed areas in Baghdad. But actually, I grew up in a neighborhood whereby it was a spectrum of Iraq. So although I did not grow up in a Shia family, but our neighbors, my childhood friends were all, and back then these boundaries did not exist. I would go with them to Najaf. I would fast Ramadan with them just for fun. So again, I just want to give that in previous generations, these rigid boundaries because of sectarianism and civil war and whatnot did not exist as such.
Yeah. And I always tell my Scottish Muslim students that I'll fast in solidarity in Ramadan when it's Ramadan in winter. In Scotland, it's only 6 hours. But the 19 and a half hours of summer. Here's a question from a colleague of mine. She works on Scottish Catholic literature, and religion and literature especially. And she's wondering a bit about the translation of the title Ya Maryam.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Yeah, it's always disheartening to deal with Anglophone publishers when it comes to titles, because they always insist on changing the titles. I am very proud of my titles, and particularly Ya Maryam, because it's so evocative and poetic and central to the novel. And the American publisher thought that Ave Maria would not be good because it would I don't know, disorient the reader and so on and so forth. And I think Hail Mary, the other option, they thought, oh, that would refer people to baseball rather than baseball, football, Hail Mary, right? Anyway, it's always a struggle because I wanted it to stay either Ya Maryam or be Ave Maria. The French translation is Ave Maria. The Spanish translation is Ave Maria. It's only in America. And so this was the compromise. Is I wanted to call it, I think it's the title of one of the chapters, the Eucharist. So the Baghdad Eucharist, and I'm against putting Baghdad and Iraq in every title because it's just too much now. But so I'm not happy with the title, but what can we do? The same thing happened with Wahda Shajarat al-Rumman, which is the pomegranate alone, and that title was kept in the Turkish, in the French, in so many others, but in English it was changed to The Corpse Washer, which makes it sound like a Gothic novel or something like that.
Yeah, it accurately describes but even I mean, it's a body wash. It's not even in Islamic tradition, it wouldn't be called a corpse washer.
No, and it's just so direct and prosaic as opposed to poetic. The pomegranate alone, which might keep you in suspense to see what is it, where is the pomegranate, why is it alone, instead of spelling it out right away, corpse washer.
And in both of those novels, the Ya Maryam and the pomegranate tree are sort of the culmination, the final ending.
Yes.
In a way that the title is almost kept, especially in the pomegranate alone, is kept in suspense. While the tree is put in the body, with the body, it's not really as present as Ya Maryam.
Yes.
Or even there, because you have, I can't remember the very pious woman, Hinan, the character in
Henna.
So yeah, a couple other questions coming in. One is asking, there's two questions about the place of sort of Jewish Iraqi culture, especially if you're looking to go back to pre-1950. I think maybe I'm forgetting the Book of Collateral Damage has a few references as well to Iraqi Jewish families who then leave and don't return. It's in
the Ya Maryam.
That's Ya Maryam, yeah. So
no, that's an excellent question, and I mean, in an interview I finished just a few days ago, I actually, it's a very important subject, and I had initially wanted to write a major work on Iraqi Jewish family, but frankly, it has become a fad in recent years. There are so many novels that have Arab Jewish characters. Not that we don't need to write them, but I think there is a problematic way, again, of invoking Arab Jews as a metaphor for a lost golden period and not invoking them for their own sake, right? So the same thing's happening to Iraqi Christians in a way. So the minorities become metaphors for some kind of lost homeland. So that's why I postponed my project, but I had to include it in Ya Maryam because it's important, and it's not the same fate in a way, but it's one other stage in the loss of the spectrum that used to be Iraq, and I think it's one of the most painful things. But now there are a lot of novels, and many of which, a lot of novels in Arabic that are about Arab Jews before and after, and I think a couple of people are even writing about it. But I had to include that because it's also, frankly, it's part of my own history and my interests in that. My aunt's house in Baghdad, their neighbors across the street were Iraqi Jews, and I was always fascinated by that. And even actually after leaving Iraq and coming to the US, the first few books that I got out of Georgetown Library were the novels of Samir Naqash, because of course we lived under dictatorship and there was a kind of a silence on what happened to the Iraqi Jews. It was never really acknowledged officially and so on and so forth. So I wanted to know so much about that. But there are now a lot of novels, Iraqi and non-Iraqi, that include Arab Jewish characters. And my contention, and you can quote me, is that oftentimes it's not done, not that there is a right way to do that, but it's done in a cliche, simplistic way. But I think it's the result of many factors, but one of them is the recognition of the loss that has happened and all of that, and frankly also more knowledge about what happened to Arab Jews, and that's because of so many of the documentaries that are coming out in Arabic and elsewhere, and some of the satellite channels covering this issue and giving the general public more information. But of course, the problem is, I think, is that Zionism and Israel are always intervening in this discussion and in the way one writes about it or the way one talks about it and so on and so forth. But it's an excellent question.
Yeah. We got a couple more questions. If you can feel free to pass on them if they're coming too much. This is from Sajid Ali, and he's wondering if you could say a little bit more. You don't have to, about the new novel and what, since you're talking about titles, or we can save that for the future.
Yeah, I don't know if I should spill the beans, as they say.
Yeah, exactly.
The new novel is about, I would say it's about two Iraqis in the US, refugees, but refugees from different periods. One is a refugee from the dictatorship period of Saddam Hussein, and one is a refugee from the recent militia violence and so on and so forth. And it just talks about also how the way a refugee sees the new country or the old country is ultimately overdetermined by their class background, and also the way they acclimate or don't acclimate to the new country is also something that's going to be the difference. So it's about contrasting these two ways of looking at what it means to be in Iraq. Does one completely forget Iraq and say, that's it, Iraq is done, I'm here, I'm an American? Or does one cling to this country that one is from? And how does that work when you're living in the country that is still involved in that? So it's about the intersection of these two characters.
Yeah, I mean, there's a ways in which those themes are also really present in your most recent novel, in the Index of the Book of Collateral Damage.
Yes,
I mean, obviously, that's also intertwined with your own narrative. I think it's fair to say, in terms of NYU, Dartmouth, even if it's not.
Yes, a little bit.
I have to admit, I was supposed to spend a semester teaching at Dartmouth this summer. It got called off because of COVID, but I was reading your novel and I was like, do I really want to go to Dartmouth?
It's beautiful in the summer. It's really wonderful, actually.
Yeah. But this notion of both, and this is a theme you've talked about, memory, place. Yeah. How do you relate to Iraq if you're not there any longer? And you've talked about this in some of your own work that isn't just fiction. Can you say a little bit more about how one holds together? I saw in a brief interview that you live in New York, but you also live in Baghdad, in a way that's beyond just physical place.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there is about 5 million Iraqis living in the diaspora. It's one of the, in terms of proportions, it's one of the bigger diasporas in the world. I think 1/5 of Iraqis don't live in Iraq because of everything that has happened. And, I'm not saying that there's a formula. There are those who acclimate and live peacefully in their new country, and there are those who don't. And there are various ways of connecting or not connecting. I know so many people who had disconnected from Iraq for 20 years, and then this last uprising it reconnected them to their country. It depends also on one's ideological position, I think. And it also depends on one's work in a way. I, being a professor of Arabic literature in a university and being part of Middle Eastern studies, there is no escaping that. Also, being someone has always been someone who follows the news and wants to know what is happening politically in the world and in his surroundings, I can't just turn off the news. So I always want to follow what's happening to Iraq because it's important to me. So, of course, it would be much better for my blood pressure to not follow news and to not know anything. But I guess here we come to what I've said so many times about technology, in that, I rail against technology every day, but technology is allowing us now to have this conversation. Technology allowed me to follow the Arab uprisings and allows me to hear people in Iraq and elsewhere speak and talk about their daily lives. So I get to know what their jokes are, what their songs are, and so on and so forth. So to live vicariously, there's so much has been written and theorized about diaspora and alienation, and I don't want to use exile. And of course, one should always acknowledge their privilege. This is what actually I'm writing about in this novel now, and that, of course, there are those, I had an easy path, relatively speaking. I have a very good job. I'm privileged in a way. There are those who are very hardworking and spend 20 or 30 years and never really make it in a way. So class comes into this as well, and how class colors all of that. Yeah, I mean, again, it's about the choice or the privilege of being engaged also. I'm always aware that some of the privileges that we have as academics is our privileges. There are so many people who are in such tough situations that don't even have the time to think about all of these things.
Yeah. We've got another question in Arabic this time from the same. So
نريد اكسسوار بحلول جودو كريشنا مورتي التي قدمها البشرية طالما الدين حاليا غير عملي ولا حلول فعالة بصيغة أخرى. ممكن فلسفة اللا انتماء تكون فعالة أكثر من غيرها. والله بصراحة شوف، أنا لا أؤمن بأن هناك حل واحد فقط لمشاكل العالم، ولا أعرف أنه هل هو الدين غير عملي. يمكن هذا مو جواب على سؤالك، لكن أنا عندي إشكالية مع كثير من الملحدين، مع العلم أنه أنا ملحد، لأنه لا يقولون تطرفاً عن الآخرين، ولا أن عندهم فكرة بإلغاء الدين من العالم. الإيمان حاجة نفسية موجودة لدى جميع البشر، البعض لا يحتاجها لكن الكثيرين يحتاجونها، ويجب أن نتعامل مع هذا. فلسفة اللا انتماء ما أعرف، أنا بالنسبة لي بصراحة مشاكل، طبعاً هناك حاجات نفسية وهناك حاجة إلى الإيمان بشيء ما، لكن مشاكل العالم مشاكل مادية. مشاكل العالم هي الفقر والعنصرية والعنف واللامساواة. هذا هو أهم شيء، وحين نتعامل مع هذه المشاكل سيصبح العالم أفضل للجميع. فلا أعرف أي شيء، أي نظرية أو إطار نظري أو أخلاقي يدعو إلى التعايش. التعايش ليس فقط كشعار لكن كممارسة. المشكلة هي دائما هو بين النظرية والممارسة. أنا لا تهمني النظريات، يهمني الممارسة اليومية، كيف تتعامل مع الآخر المختلف، ليس فقط دينيا، الآخر المختلف بالجندر أو الأفقر من طبقة أخرى. فيمكن ما جاوبت على سؤالك، لكن أنا دائما أحب أن أنهي أجوبتي بالله أعلم.
It's Allahu Alam is probably my favorite tradition of Islamic jurisprudence,
and it's very postmodern.
But it also should be something revived with questions like that. So
no, I agree, because I certainly believe that, and I always use it with my students to know that my interpretation is that there is more to be interpreted and to learn. This is not the closure, and this is not the end of the debate.
Yeah, and to keep up with some of these themes that were just discussed, again, I give you the right to not comment on this question as well. This is coming from my colleague, who's a professor and a scholar of the history of Christian-Muslim relations, Hugh Goddard. He mentions another recent translation by Jonathan Wright on the Iraqi Christ. If you wanted to comment at all, I know that can get complicated with novelists, but the ways in which, again, maybe religion, the Eucharist are depicted. I actually haven't read this novel, so I can't add anything else. So again, feel free to demur if it's complicated territory.
No, yeah, it is complicated and sensitive. I just want to say that, of course, we inhabit different ideological positions, and there are different ways of writing about Iraq. I'm not going to comment about how other writers write about Iraq. They are free to do so, and that's how they see their work. So I leave it up to the readers and to the critics.
That's great. So we're nearing the end of time. If anyone wants to ask one last question, they're happy to, or I will ask a few more. But I'll give you a second if anyone wants to engage with some of these themes. As we wait, just in case, as a reminder, all 4 novels are available to purchase anywhere that you get books, preferably not the Behemoth. So you can find them from Yale University Press, from thebookstore.com and other sources. They're really wonderful
thank you.
engagements. And if anyone really wants a challenge to try to find, especially Ijam, if you want to try to read it in Arabic, good luck, especially if you're not a native Arabic speaker.
I wanted to say that the last book is this poetry book, Kama fi Sama, which engages a lot with the language of the Bible, actually, and a lot of Christian themes in it. So
yeah. With the heavens and things. So yeah. So there's a question about literary translation. Would you want to answer that?
What's the question? How did you begin a literary translation with your research, your own work, through another? Okay, actually, back in Baghdad, I did English literature, and translation was a minor, and we had an excellent professor. I still remember him, Amjad Hussein, who had studied at Stanford. But then in coming to the US, I mean, in a way, some of us translate every day if you live in these communities. But I was always into literary translation just as a hobby. A lot of times there are lines that I like that I translate. So I began to translate a lot of Arabic poetry. But of course, then because of the requirements of my academic work that I had to, because I was working on Arabic poetry, and it was understood that whatever one publishes is going to be in English, so I had to translate everything. But the bulk of my translation has not, even though I've translated these books by Darwish and Saad Youssef and a novel by Ibtisam Azim and my own, but I've translated hundreds of poems from Arabic into English for the sheer love of the poems themselves and making them, giving them a new life in another language. And also as a writer, and I learned this from Merwin and others, in that, translation, especially for poets, is a very important practice for improving one's language, because you're kind of simulating poetry in trying to find the best word to go and fit that image and so on and so forth. And it's also when it comes to Darwish and others, it's an act of love in a way to translate one's favorite poets. In this respect, I think, although initially I used to think that academia was bad for me as a writer and a poet because it delayed me, and then you learn that you gain so many tools actually from the research itself, and you're exposed to so much. So it's a strategic planning for the future. I don't want to use the word investment in the future.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I hope all of you that are listening or will listen in the future will consider looking into Sinan Antoon's novels. I wanted to end with a short reading from a snapshot from The Corpse Washer, which is one of my favorite starts. It's right at the very beginning, and he's talking about the increase of death in Baghdad. And the connection between death and his own. And I'll just read this as a sort of brief reading to conclude. If death is a postman, then I receive his letters every day. I am the one who opens carefully the bloodied and torn envelopes. I am the one who washes them, who removes the stamps of death and dries and perfumes them, mumbling what I don't entirely believe in. Then I wrap them carefully in white so they may reach their final reader, the grave. But letters are piling up, Father, tenfold more than what you used to see in the span of a week, now pass me in 1 or 2 days. If you were alive, Father, would you say that it is the fate of God and God's will? I wish you were here so I could leave Mother with you and escape without feeling guilty. You were heavily armed with faith, and that made your heart a castle. My heart, by contrast, is an abandoned house whose windows are shattered and doors unhinged. Ghosts play inside it, and the winds wail. I hope that little snapshot will encourage you to go out and to read, pick and read, as it's famously said in Augustine's Confessions. So thank you again, Sinan Antoon, for joining us. And
thank you so much. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. This was really wonderful. I really appreciate it.
And we look forward to more conversations. If you want to join us next week, we'll be hearing from Hugh Goddard. They've just published a second edition of his History of Christian-Muslim Relations. So I hope to see some of you again next week. Thank you so much.